They say Scotland was a land no empire could tame. Rome tried and failed. Kings bled for its throne, only to be betrayed in their own halls. Entire villages vanished to plague, fire, and sword. But here's the mystery. Why did Scotland survive when so many medieval kingdoms were swallowed by history? This is not the Scotland of bagpipes and tartan. This is the Scotland of warlords and saints, of walls built to keep invaders out and crowns bought with murder. So let me ask you, what if the true story of medieval Scotland is not about victory, but about survival? And what if survival itself was the greatest act of defiance? Too many voices from Scotland's past were silenced forever. Don't let yours be one of them. Drop a comment right now. Subscribe, like, share, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Be part of the record that can't be erased.
Scotland begins not in triumph, but in silence. A silence broken only by wind on the high moors or the crash of waves against black cliffs. Here the Romans marched to the very edge of their world and turned back. They raised walls of stone to hold back what they could not conquer. Not just men, but a spirit, wild, unyielding, and unknown. The Picts painted themselves in blue, their names etched into Roman fear, but lost to their own descendants. The Gaels came across the sea, carrying saints and swords. Vikings burned the coasts, carved runes into stones, and vanished into legend. No single people owned this land. It was a crossroads of tribes, a graveyard of ambitions, a stage where even empires faltered. And yet, through all this, something endured. A fragile kingdom called Alba, a patchwork of lords and clans who should have torn each other apart, a people who should have disappeared like the Picts before them. But they didn't. And that is the mystery. Why did Scotland survive when stronger, wealthier kingdoms, Northumbria, Strathclyde, even mighty Norway, crumbled into dust? The answer is not found in kings alone. It lies in betrayals that reshape the throne, in blood spilled on altars, and in a stubborn refusal to surrender to anyone, not Rome, not England, not fate itself. This is not the Scotland of romance. This is the Scotland of shadows. And if you follow its story, you will discover that survival itself can be more shocking and more powerful than victory.
The empire that boasted it ruled the world drew a line in stone and stopped. In the year 122 CE, Emperor Hadrian ordered his legions to build a wall from sea to sea. Not a monument of conquest, but of containment. Hadrian's walls stretched 80 Roman miles, studded with forts, watchtowers, and ditches. And yet, its true meaning was far simpler. Here, the empire ends. Why? Because beyond that wall lay Caledonia. Not a single kingdom, but a tangle of tribes the Romans called gens Ephyrae, wild peoples. Tacitus, writing of his father-in-law Agricola's campaigns, describes them as tall, fierce, and unyielding. At Mons Graupius in 83 CE, their leader Calgacus declared, "They make a desert and they call it peace." Rome may have won that battle, but it never broke the spirit of those tribes. For 4 decades after, governors tried. Legions marched into the highlands, burned settlements, cut down forests. But the Caledonians did not fight set-piece battles.
They struck supply lines, slaughtered stragglers, melted into bog and moor. By the 2nd century, Rome had learned that a war here could not be won, only endured. So, Hadrian built his wall, and 20 years later, Antoninus Pius dared to move the frontier further north, raising the Antonine Wall across the 4th Clyde Isthmus. The experiment lasted barely a generation. By 1602 CE, the wall was abandoned, the legions retreating south once again. The inscriptions left behind tell their own story. The barbarians drove us out.
And still, Rome tried again. The Historia Augusta records constant uprisings, raids that burst through the frontier, and entire units massacred in ambush. By the 3rd century, imperial chroniclers spoke of Britain as more liability than prize. Compare this with Carthage, razed to the ground. Egypt, chained into Rome's granary. Judea, crushed under Titus's siege engines. Gaul and Spain turned into provinces without end. But Caledonia? Even at the height of Rome's power, it remained beyond reach. To the Romans, the land became legend, a place of mist and darkness where maps ended and monsters were said to roam. To the Caledonians, Rome became an enemy too vast to defeat, but not too vast to resist. And that is the first paradox of Scottish history. This land was not born in victory, but in defiance. Rome could not erase them, but what price would these tribes pay to remain free? The answer would come not from legions, but from centuries of blood. When Rome faded from Britain, it did not leave one Scotland behind. It left 4. To the north and east were the Picts, a people at once visible and invisible. Visible in their carved stones, scattered across the highlands, beasts no one can identify, symbols no one can decode. Invisible in the silence of their language, lost to history without a trace. They appear in Bede's chronicles and in Irish annals, but never in their own words. Who they were, how they lived, what they believed, all is filtered through the eyes of their enemies. And yet they endured for centuries, holding their ground in mountains and forests, feared by every neighbor.
Across the western seas came the Scots of Dalriata, Gaelic settlers from Ireland. Their ships carried both swords and scriptures. They were warriors, yes, but also missionaries, led by Columba, who in 563 founded a monastery at Iona. From that island, the light of learning spread through darkness, copying manuscripts, sending monks across Britain. But their small kingdom was fragile, hemmed in by Picts to the north and Britons to the south. Their strength came not from land, but from sea, a kingdom afloat on wooden ships, bound to Ireland by water as much as to Scotland by soil. South of them stood the Britons of Strathclyde, descendants of Rome's shadow. From their stronghold at Dumbarton Rock, they guarded the Clyde Valley. They spoke a tongue closer to Welsh than Gaelic, and for centuries they clung to the last echoes of Roman Britain. Strathclyde was the reminder that Scotland was not only Celtic, but also a land where Roman roads and forts lingered like ghosts. And pressing from the southeast were the Angles of Northumbria, expanding, hungry, armed with both faith and fire. By the 7th century, Northumbria was the most powerful kingdom in Britain. In 685, their king Egfrith marched deep into Pictish land, seeking to break them forever. Instead, at Nectansmere, he and his army were surrounded, slaughtered, and left among the marshes. The Picts had broken Northumbria's spell, and for the first time, they proved that even a great Anglo-Saxon power could be humbled. But Scotland was no single story. The The Picts warred with the Scots clashed with the Britons, the Angles pressed them all. The land was a chessboard of tribes, and unity seemed impossible. Until Kenneth MacAlpin.
In 843, he became king of both Scots and Picts. Later chronicles, like John of Flodden's Chronica Gentis Scotorum, whispered of treachery, a feast at Scone where MacAlpin betrayed the Pictish nobles, slaughtering them and seizing their crown. Some call it the treason of Scone. Others believe it was marriage, alliance, slow assimilation. The truth is hidden. What we know is simple. After MacAlpin, the Picts vanish. Their name, their language, their identity. Gone. Absorbed into a new kingdom, Alba. But Alba was not yet Scotland. It was fragile, untested, born of mystery and blood. And even as it struggled to breathe, sails appeared on the horizon. Longships, dragon-proud, carrying raiders from the north. The Vikings were coming, and Alba would face its first trial by fire. The kingdom that would one day be Scotland began not with triumph, but with disappearance. In the middle of the 9th century, the name of the Picts, a people who had resisted Rome, defeated Northumbria, and carved mysteries into stone, vanishes from the record. After centuries of power, they are suddenly gone. In their place stands a new kingdom, Alba. Later chroniclers told a tale of betrayal. They called it the treason of Scone. At a royal feast, the king of the Scots, Kenneth MacAlpin, invited the Pictish nobles to dine. But the benches were rigged with traps. When the Picts sat, they were thrown helpless onto hidden blades. The massacre cleared the way for MacAlpin to claim both crowns.
It is a grisly legend, too neat, too convenient, and perhaps too late. The story was not written until centuries after. But whether by bloodshed, by marriage, or by slow assimilation, the result was the same. The Picts disappear. The Scots remain, and Alba is born. Yet, Alba was not a secure kingdom. It was a fragile coalition of Gaels, absorbed Picts, and scattered Britons, and at its core lay a crown that could never rest steady. For Alba was ruled not by primogeniture, the passing of father to eldest son, but by tanistry. The kingship belonged to the royal kindred as a whole, and any eligible male might claim it. Brothers, cousins, nephews, each death of a king opened the field to rivals. Succession in Alba was less inheritance than trial by survival. This system produced strength in desperate times, ensuring a capable war leader could rise. But it also bred mistrust. Brothers turned on brothers. Assassinations cut down kings before their reigns could begin. The throne itself became a weapon of rivalry, not unity. And all the while, from the sea, came the hammer blows of the Norse. In 795, Norsemen first struck Iona, the sacred isle where Columba's monks had prayed for 2 centuries. They burned the monastery in 802, returned in 806, and slaughtered 68 monks in a single raid. In 870, the great fortress of Dumbarton Rock, capital of the Britons of Strathclyde, fell after a 4-month Norse siege. Its people were carried into slavery. Across the north and west, Jarls carved their own kingdoms, in Orkney, in Shetland, in the Hebrides. For Alba's kings, survival meant balancing between enemies on all sides, Norse fleets, English armies from the south, and rivals within their own bloodline. Kenneth's successors moved their power base to Scone, where kings were crowned upon the Stone of Destiny, a block of sandstone that legend claimed was Jacob's pillow from the Bible, carried through Ireland and into Scotland. It was less relic than symbol, a reminder that Alba's kings ruled not by force alone, but by sacred right. And yet, even symbols could not shield them from chaos. Constantine II, ruling from 900 to 943, fought war after war against the Norse and against England. He faced Athelstan at the Great Battle of Brunanburh in 937, a clash that chroniclers called the Great War of Britain. Athelstan emerged victorious, and yet Alba did not fall. Constantine returned, bloodied but unbroken, and his long reign gave the kingdom a fragile stability.
Still, Alba's survival came by inches. Its kings lost battles and won few. Its borders shifted. Its people were divided by language, by custom, by loyalty. To look at Alba in the 10th century is to see not the strong Scotland of later centuries, but a kingdom barely clinging to existence, a thin thread of rule that could have snapped at any moment. One failed king, one disastrous battle, one betrayal too many, and the experiment would have ended. Strathclyde would vanish. Northumbria would vanish. Many kingdoms of this age turned to dust. But Alba endured. And that endurance is the riddle. Was it chance? Was it ruthless kingship? Or was it something deeper? The birth of a people who would rather bleed than vanish. For now, Alba stood, but the storm of the Middle Ages was only beginning. The field of Brunanburh was soaked in blood. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls it the Great Battle, the hardest fight ever fought in Britain. The ground was said to be slick with corpses, ravens fat from feasting. To the victors, it was glory. To the survivors, it was something else entirely, the price of endurance. The year was 937. Athelstan, grandson of Alfred the Great, ruled a united England. For the first time in history, Wessex and Mercia stood as one kingdom, backed by wealth, armies, and bishops. To his enemies, Athelstan looked unstoppable, a man who sought not just rule, but dominance of the whole island. So a coalition formed against him. From the sea came Olaf Guthfredson, Norse king of Dublin, leading fleets of warriors. From the west marched Owen, king of Strathclyde, determined to resist English encroachment. And from the north came Constantine II, king of Alba. Gray-haired now, a veteran of 30 years on the throne. His kingdom was young, still fragile, but Constantine knew that if Athelstan crushed the north, Alba might never rise again. This was no small skirmish. Chroniclers say it was the clash of 5 kings, a struggle for the future of Britain. At Brunanburh, the coalition fell upon Athelstan's army. For hours, the fighting raged. The English poem in the Chronicle exults in Athelstan's victory. 5 young kings lay slain on the battlefield, and 7 earls, countless of the host. Among the dead was Constantine's son. Cut down, the royal line itself struck in the heart. And yet, Constantine lived. Defeated, yes, forced from the field, his allies scattered, their dead unburied. Athelstan was triumphant, but Alba did not fall. Constantine returned north, battered, mourning, but still a king.
Here lies the paradox. Why does Scottish history remember a defeat? Because in the 10th century, survival itself was victory. Northumbria, once mighty, would collapse into history's shadows. Strathclyde would wither. Even Norse Dublin would fade. But Alba, though beaten at Brunanburh, endured. For Constantine, the price was personal. His son was gone. His cause had failed.
6 years later, weary of war, he abdicated. He left the crown to Malcolm I and took the tonsure, retiring to St. Andrews as a monk. In his abdication lies the symbol of Alba's struggle. Kings might fall, but the kingdom endured. Brühlenburg did not end Alba. In a strange way, it proved its resilience. In a storm of blood and ambition, Scotland's fragile kingdom held its ground where others crumbled. But Constantine's long reign left a question unresolved, a question that would haunt every successor. If survival is the only prize, what happens when a king is too weak to even survive? Alba had outlasted England's sword, but could it endure its own kings? Some borders are drawn on parchment. Scotland's was drawn in blood. In the year 1018, on the banks of the River Tweed, a battle raged that would give Scotland its shape for the next 1,000 years. It was called Carham, and it was here that a fragile kingdom became a nation.
The man who led Alba into that battle was Malcolm II, ruthless, cunning, battle-scarred. He had seized the throne in 1005 by slaughtering his rival, Kenneth III, and, according to some chronicles, pursued his victory with such ferocity that no challenger survived. His reign was marked by one grim reality. Alba was still young, still brittle, still hemmed in on every side. To the west, Norse jarls ruled the seas, raiding and settling in the Hebrides, Orkney, and beyond. To the south, the great Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of England was pushing northward, its kings eager to press into Lothian. And within Alba itself, unity was fragile. Gaelic Scots, former Picts, and Britons of Strathclyde had been fused into one crown, but their loyalties remained divided. It was into this crucible that Malcolm marched. At his side was Owen the Bald, the king of Strathclyde, whose Brittonic kingdom still clung to independence, but increasingly leaned on Alba's protection. Together, they faced Northumbria, the northern stronghold of Anglo-Saxon England. Their prize, Lothian. For centuries, Lothian had belonged to the Angles. Its fertile plains stretched from the Firth of Forth to the River Tweed. It was wealth, it was farmland, it was access to the English-speaking world. To control Lothian was to command the bridge between Scotland and England. The chronicles give us few details of Carham, but the silence is telling. What is remembered is victory, crushing, decisive. Northumbrian leaders fell, their armies scattered. When the smoke cleared, Malcolm and Owen held the field. Lothian was theirs. This was more than a conquest. This was identity. With Lothian in Alba's grasp, the kingdom no longer looked like a Gaelic enclave clinging to the highlands. It now included Anglian lands, Brittonic Strathclyde, and Gaelic heartlands fused into one. It was at Carham that Scotland's southern frontier was fixed, the River Tweed as the line between two nations. Remarkably, it is a frontier that has endured into the modern world.
Yet Malcolm's triumph carried shadows. Strathclyde's independence would soon fade, absorbed into Alba, but its submission was not given freely. The Norse threat remained constant. And within the kingdom, the greatest danger lay not in foreign enemies, but in the royal succession. Malcolm II had no sons. His heirs were his daughter's children. Duncan, who would one day face Macbeth, and other grandsons whose claims would spark bloodshed.
in a land ruled by Tanistry, where the crown went not to the eldest son, but to the strongest hand. This meant disaster was inevitable. The throne of Alba could never be passed. It could only be taken. So, Carham was not the end of struggle. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Malcolm had secured Scotland's border, but in doing so, he left a kingdom held together by fragile alliances and uncertain bloodlines. The shape of Scotland was fixed. Its future was not. Shakespeare gave us a tyrant. History gives us a king. In 1034, Duncan I inherited the throne of Alba, the grandson of Malcolm II. On parchment, his claim was strong. In reality, his hold was brittle. He was young, untested, and the kingdom he ruled was no calm inheritance. It was a storm of Gaelic lords, Norse raiders, and ambitious cousins waiting for a crack in his armor. The chronicles do not flatter Duncan. The Chronicle of the Kings of Alba and Marianus Scotus paint him as reckless. In 1039, he led a disastrous campaign against Durham in Northumbria, only to be driven back in defeat. In the north, he failed to check the Norse in Moray and Orkney. A king who could not command victory was, in Alba, no king at all. Enter Macbeth.
Macbeth was no shadowy usurper. He was Mormaer of Moray, a lord in the wild north whose power rivaled the king's. Through his mother, he carried royal blood. Through his wife, Gruach, granddaughter of Kenneth III, he tied himself to the very heart of the royal line. His claim was legitimate, his strength undeniable. In 1040, the two men met in battle at Pitgavany near Elgin. Shakespeare imagined a midnight murder, daggers in the dark, a guilty conscience whispering in the night. The truth was simpler and harsher. Duncan led his men to war. Macbeth's forces crushed them. Duncan was slain on the battlefield, not in his bed. In the law of Alba, the brutal law of Tanistry, it was not treachery, it was succession. For the next 17 years, Macbeth ruled, and he ruled well. 17 years, in an age where most kings barely survived 5. He brought stability to a kingdom on the edge. He distributed wealth to the church. In 1050, he went further still, journeying to Rome itself. Marianus Scotus records that he gave alms to the poor there, a northern king showing his power and piety on the stage of Christendom. A tyrant does not cross Europe to pray at Rome. A king does. So how did Macbeth become a monster? The answer lies not in the 11th century, but in the 17th. When Shakespeare wrote Macbeth in 1606, he did so for a king, James VI of Scotland, newly crowned James I of England. James claimed descent from Banquo, the noble man betrayed in the play. Shakespeare turned Banquo into a martyr, Macbeth into a murderer, and history into propaganda. The real Macbeth was buried beneath theater. But history is never theater alone. Macbeth's reign was not without blood. He fought off English invasion. He faced rivals from within Alba. In 1054, Siward, the great Earl of Northumbria, invaded at the behest of Duncan's exiled son Malcolm. Macbeth survived that onslaught, a testament to his strength. But 3 years later, at Lumphanan, Malcolm struck again, this time with English steel behind him. Macbeth was cut down in battle. His severed head was sent to Malcolm as proof.
Malcolm would be crowned as Malcolm III, beginning a dynasty that would bind Scotland closer to England and forever tilt its destiny toward the south. But something was lost in that victory: the independence of Alba's older traditions. So who was Macbeth? Not a tyrant, not a saint, a king shaped by the sword,
who gave Alba its longest peace in a century, only to be remembered as a villain by poets writing for another king, 600 years later. And that leaves us with a question. If Macbeth was not the monster, then was Scotland's destiny truly shaped by kings at all, or by the myths they left behind?
Scotland's destiny was not only forged in battle, sometimes it was forged in marriage. In 1070, Malcolm Canmore, Malcolm III, took as his queen Margaret of Wessex. That union changed Scotland forever. Malcolm was no stranger to violence. He had seized the throne in 1058 by overthrowing Lulach, Macbeth's stepson, and spent much of his long reign raiding across the border. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records his constant wars with England, especially after William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in 1066. To the English, Malcolm was a predator, burning Durham in 1070, harrying Northumbria repeatedly, testing Norman power. To the Gaels, he was Canmore, great chief, a warrior who upheld their traditions of kingship. But Malcolm's kingdom was shifting. The Norman conquest had overturned England, and streams of Anglo-Saxon exiles fled north. Among them was Margaret, daughter of Edward the Exile and sister to Edgar Etheling, the last male heir of the old royal house of Wessex. According to the 12th century Vita Sancte Margarite, written by her confessor Turgot, Margaret never sought a crown. She wished for a religious life, but fate placed her in Malcolm's court at Dunfermline, and the king chose her as his queen. Their marriage was more than dynastic, it was cultural revolution. Margaret was pious, educated, steeped in the traditions of the English church. Turgot paints her as almost saintly, fasting, giving alms, correcting what she saw as the barbarous customs of the Gaels. She reformed the celebration of Easter, abolished older Celtic practices, and tied the Scottish Church closer to Rome. She invited Benedictine monks to establish monasteries, founded a church at Dunfermline, and turned the royal court into a place of devotion. But behind piety lay politics. Through Margaret, Scotland absorbed English influence. Her sons grew up speaking not only Gaelic but English, shaped by her learning, her faith, her refinement. They would one day sit on the throne, Edgar, Alexander, David, kings who would transform Scotland into a feudal state modelled on England and France.
Malcolm, by contrast, remained the old king. He could not read, but he listened as Margaret read scripture aloud. He fought the Normans with fire and sword, even as his court became a haven for Anglo-Saxon nobles dispossessed by William. He embodied the tension of his age, a Gaelic warrior ruling beside an English saint. This was the fracture line. In the Highlands and Western Isles, Gaelic traditions endured, kingship rooted in clan and kin. But in the lowlands and at court, Anglo-Norman customs were taking hold, stone castles rising, monasteries founded, feudal law creeping in. Scotland was beginning to split. 2 cultures, 2 languages, 1 crown. In 1093, everything shattered. Malcolm invaded Northumbria again, only to fall in battle at Alnwick. Days later, Margaret died at Edinburgh Castle, broken by grief. Their deaths plunged Scotland into chaos. For years, the throne was contested between Margaret's Anglo-Norman sons and Malcolm's older, Gaelic-born heirs. Civil war followed, tearing open the very divide their marriage had created. And yet, the legacy of that union endured.
Margaret was canonized as a saint in 1250. Malcolm's line survived through her sons. Together, they set Scotland on a path away from its Gaelic roots toward a kingdom that looked increasingly to England and Europe. It was a marriage of devotion. It was a marriage of politics. It was the marriage that made two Scotlands, Highland and Lowland. And the crack between them would never truly close. Scotland had known kings of the sword. David I was a king of the pen.
When he came to power in 1124, Alba was still a kingdom of clans and kinship, its roots Gaelic, its law tribal, its economy local. Kingship meant raiding, tribute, and the shifting loyalties of rival lords. David would change all of that. He was called, in later chronicles, the Scottish Charlemagne, because like Charlemagne, he did not just rule, he rebuilt his realm from its foundations. David's vision was shaped far from Scotland. As a youth, he had lived in England, in the court of Henry I, his brother-in-law. There he saw a different world, barons bound by oaths, castles of stone rising above towns, royal law enforced by sheriffs, and monasteries that served as schools, farms, and engines of culture. When the crown of Scotland fell to him, David brought that vision north. The revolution began with land. David imported Anglo-Norman knights, men like the Bruces, the Stuarts, and the Commons, and granted them vast estates in return for service. These newcomers built castles not of wood but of stone, anchoring their power in landscapes once ruled by Gaelic families. They owed their loyalty to the king, not to kin. Feudalism had come to Scotland. Next came the towns. David founded burghs. Royal settlements granted charters for trade. Perth, Stirling, Edinburgh, Berwick, Roxburgh. In them, merchants held markets and fairs. Scots sold wool, hides, and salted fish. Foreign traders brought wine, cloth, and luxuries. Burghs turned Scotland outward, connecting it to Flanders, France, and the North Sea world. They became the beating heart of a new economy.
Then came law. David created the office of sheriff, royal officers who carried the king's justice into the shires. Where once law had been clan vengeance, now royal writ ran. Justice was no longer the gift of local lords, but the command of the crown. And then came faith. David founded a network of monasteries, Augustinians at Holyrood, Tyrannensians at Kelso, and most famously, Cistercians at Melrose in 1136. Melrose became a jewel of Christendom in the north. The monks drained marshes, introduced new farming techniques, copied manuscripts, and spread Roman discipline into every corner of the land. David's church reforms bound Scotland closer to Rome and to Europe. But every revolution has its cost. David's reforms elevated lowland Scotland. Burghs, castles, and abbeys transformed the east and south. But in the north and west, the Gaels saw something else: dispossession. Ancient families lost land to foreign knights. The Gaelic language and customs were pushed aside in court. Even the church was reformed against older Celtic traditions. For the Highlands, David's modernization looked like conquest. So was David an Anglicizer or a modernizer? Both. He remade Scotland into a European kingdom, but he also planted the seeds of division. The Highland-Lowland fault line, the tension between Gaelic past and Anglo-Norman future, began in his reign. When David died in 1153,
Scotland was unrecognizable from the realm he inherited. Castles guarded its towns. Monks plowed its fields. Markets connected it to the continent. Monks no longer ruled by kinship alone, but by institutions of law and faith. Scotland had entered Europe.
But something was left behind in the march of progress, the Gaelic heart of the kingdom. And what was lost would return centuries later as rebellion. There are moments in history when a kingdom seems untouchable. For Scotland, that moment came under the Alexanders, and it ended in a single night's fall from a horse. When Alexander II inherited the crown in 1214, Scotland was still recovering from centuries of Viking raids, Anglo-Norman pressure, and internal rivalries. He was only 16, yet he proved shrewd. He secured peace with England by marrying Joan, sister of Henry III, and he stamped out rebellions in Murray and Galloway. His reign was not without blood, but it brought stability. He turned his gaze westward, seeking to bring the Hebrides under Scottish rule, long held by the kings of Norway. But death caught him in 1249 before he could finish the task, dying on campaign against the Isles. His son, Alexander III, only 8 years old, inherited both crown and ambition. At first, guardians ruled in his name, but as he came of age, Alexander showed a steady hand. He renewed peace with England by marrying Margaret, daughter of Henry III, binding Scotland to its southern neighbour. He expanded burghs, Perth, Aberdeen, Berwick, which flourished as trade centres. Monasteries thrived, chronicles were written, law courts functioned with rare continuity. It was, by the standards of the age, a kingdom at peace. But one shadow remained: Norway. The Isles still looked to the Norse crown, and in 1263, King Haakon IV launched a vast invasion to reassert his claim. His fleet stretched the horizon, a dragon-proud armada. The Scots met them at Largs on the Ayrshire coast.
The battle was chaotic. Storm winds scattered Haakon's fleet. Norse warriors fought on the beaches, but the momentum was gone. Though not a decisive military triumph, the campaign collapsed. Haakon withdrew, dying soon after in Orkney. In 1266, the Treaty of Perth ceded the Hebrides and the Isle of Man to Scotland. For the first time in 500 years, the Viking threat was ended. With the Isles secure, Alexander III's Scotland entered a golden age. Chroniclers describe it as a time of prosperity. Crops grew in abundance, men feared no war, and every man dwelt secure beneath his vine and fig tree. Burghs thrived on wool exports and North Sea trade. Stone castles rose, law courts were respected. Monasteries like Melrose and Arbroath became centers of learning and art. For a generation, Scotland seemed strong, wealthy, and united. But peace is always fragile. By the 1280s, tragedy struck. Alexander's wife, Margaret of England, died. His sons followed, one by one, carried off by illness. By 1286, only one heir remained, his granddaughter, the Maid of Norway. On the night of March 19, 1286, Alexander was riding to be with his new queen. His advisors begged him to wait until morning, but he pressed on through storm and darkness. Somewhere near Kinghorn, his horse stumbled. The king was thrown. By dawn, Alexander III was dead. A kingdom that had known 70 years of order now stood leaderless. The crown passed to the Maid of Norway, a child living overseas. She was Scotland's last hope, the fragile thread on which the golden age now hung. But fate is merciless. In 1290, her ship was lost in Orkney. The child queen died before setting foot in Scotland. With her death, the golden age was gone. The throne lay empty, the nobility divided,
and Scotland stood on the brink. For Edward I of England was waiting, and the long storm of the Wars of Independence was about to begin.
It began with a child's death, and with her, Scotland's crown slipped into the abyss. Margaret, the Maid of Norway, heir to Alexander III, never lived to wear her crown. Her death in 1290 left Scotland without a monarch, without an heir, and without a future. A kingdom that had enjoyed decades of stability now stood leaderless. Into the void came claimants, 13 in all, each pressing bloodlines, parchments, and ancient ties. It was not merely a succession crisis, it was a feeding frenzy. Two houses stood above the rest. The Balliols, with John Balliol pressing his descent from David, Earl of Huntingdon, and the Bruces, led by Robert Bruce the Elder, Lord of Annandale, who claimed the throne should pass to the nearest male heir. Both men had power, wealth, and supporters ready for civil war. The guardians of the realm feared bloodshed, and so they turned, fatally, to England's king, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, a man who had already crushed Wales beneath his heel. The guardians asked him to arbitrate. Edward agreed, but with one condition. He would not serve as judge unless the Scots first acknowledged him as their overlord. At Norham, on the banks of the Tweed, in May 1291, the Scottish nobility assembled. Chroniclers describe the scene: proud lords of Alba, bending the knee, compelled to recognize England's king as their lord paramount. For the first time in living memory, Scotland bowed to another crown. It was legal theater, but it was humiliation made flesh. By the 1280s, tragedy struck. Alexander's wife, Margaret of England, died. His sons followed, one by one, carried off by illness. By 1286, only one heir remained, his granddaughter, the Maid of Norway. On the night of March 19, 1286, Alexander was riding to be with his new queen. His advisors begged him to wait until morning, but he pressed on through storm and darkness. Somewhere near Kinghorn, his horse stumbled. The king was thrown. By dawn, Alexander III was dead. A kingdom that had known 70 years of order now stood leaderless. The crown passed to the Maid of Norway, a child living overseas. She was Scotland's last hope, the fragile thread on which the Golden Age now hung. But fate is merciless. In 1290, her ship was lost in Orkney. The child queen died before setting foot in Scotland. With her death, the Golden Age was gone. The throne lay empty, the nobility divided, and Scotland stood on the brink. For Edward I of England was waiting, and the long storm of the Wars of Independence was about to begin.
Edward stretched the process for over a year. He examined genealogies, called witnesses, and held elaborate hearings. But his verdict was never in doubt. Balliol, though less forceful than Bruce, was younger and more pliable. On St. Andrew's Day, 1292, John Balliol was crowned at Scone. The stone of destiny was beneath him, but the true power was in Edward's hands. What followed was not kingship, but servitude. Edward summoned Balliol to Westminster like a vassal, forcing him to stand in the English court and answer charges brought by his own subjects. He undermined Scotland's parliament, overturned judgments of its courts, and treated its king as a petty sheriff. The people called Balliol Tomb Tabard, the empty coat. Yet weakness is not always cowardice. In 1295, Balliol struck back. He allied with France,
Scotland's first step in the Ald Alliance, binding the two kingdoms against Edward's growing empire. It was a brave gamble, but a doomed one. Edward responded with fire. In 1296, he descended on Berwick-upon-Tweed, the greatest of Scotland's burghs. What followed was a massacre. Contemporary accounts speak of 7,000 slaughtered. Men, women, children, cut down in the streets. Blood ran into the sea. Berwick, jewel of Scotland's trade, became a charnel house. Edward's wrath did not stop there. Balliol was dragged before him, stripped of his royal insignia, his arms torn from his surcoat. Chroniclers say Edward mocked him, calling him not king, but tomb-tabard, before sending him into captivity in the Tower. Scotland had a monarch no more. Its nobles had sworn fealty. Its castles were occupied. Its sacred relic, the Stone of Destiny, was ripped from Scone and carried to Westminster Abbey, a trophy beneath the English throne.
A kingdom once proud lay prostrate, its crown broken, its dignity trampled. But humiliation breeds resistance. In the towns and the glens, men began to whisper of vengeance. Among them was a knight's son, no lord, no prince, but a man of fire and fury. His name was William Wallace, and he would set Scotland ablaze. Great lords bent the knee, kings were broken, castles surrendered. But in 1297, resistance came not from a prince, but from a commoner, William Wallace. His origins are cloaked in silence, perhaps born in Elderslie, perhaps in Ayrshire. Son of a minor knight, not a man destined for thrones or chronicles. Before 1297, his name is a shadow, and then, suddenly, it is fire. The country was crushed beneath Edward I's heel, Berwick burned, thousands massacred, King John Balliol stripped of his crown and mocked as tomb-tabard. Scotland's nobles, one by one, bent before Edward's power. Only in whispers, only in the hills and glens did rebellion stir. Wallace struck at Lanark. An English sheriff, William Heselrig, was cut down. It was a small act, but it lit a spark. Men gathered to him, not lords, not earls, farmers, townsmen, desperate men. Wallace became more than a leader. He became a symbol, proof that defiance was still possible. A kingdom once proud lay prostrate, its crown broken, its dignity trampled. But humiliation breeds resistance. In the towns and the glens, men began to whisper of vengeance. Among them was a knight's son, no lord, no prince, but a man of fire and fury. His name was William Wallace, and he would set Scotland ablaze. Great lords bent the knee, kings were broken, castles surrendered. But in 1297, resistance came not from a prince, but from a commoner, William Wallace. His origins are cloaked in silence, perhaps born in Elderslie, perhaps in Ayrshire. Son of a minor knight, not a man destined for thrones or chronicles. Before 1297, his name is a shadow, and then, suddenly, it is fire. The country was crushed beneath Edward I's heel, Berwick burned, thousands massacred, King John Balliol stripped of his crown and mocked as tomb-tabard. Scotland's nobles, one by one, bent before Edward's power. Only in whispers, only in the hills and glens did rebellion stir. Wallace struck at Lanark. An English sheriff, William Heselrig, was cut down. It was a small act, but it lit a spark. Men gathered to him, not lords, not earls, farmers, townsmen, desperate men. Wallace became more than a leader. He became a symbol, proof that defiance was still possible.
And then came Stirling. The English marched north, their army vast, their cavalry glittering in steel. To them, crushing Scots was routine. But Wallace and Andrew Murray chose the ground, the River Forth, a narrow timber bridge, a choke point. They waited as the English poured across, horses and men packed tight, unable to maneuver. Only half had crossed when Wallace gave the signal. The Scots charged. The bridge collapsed under the press. Panic, slaughter, chaos. Cavalry trampled their own footmen. English banners fell into the water. The survivors fled. In numbers, it was a skirmish. In spirit, it was an earthquake. Edward's invincible empire had been humiliated by men who owned no crowns, no castles. Wallace was named Guardian of the Realm. For a moment, Scotland had found its champion. But triumph breeds fury. Edward I marched north in 1298 with an army built to crush rebellion. At Falkirk, Wallace tried again. He set his men in schiltrons, great circles of spearmen bristling against the cavalry. At first, they held. But Edward unleashed his longbowmen. Arrows rained down, tearing gaps through flesh and wood. The schiltrons broke. The field drowned in blood. Wallace fled. The nobles abandoned him. He resigned the guardianship. Some say he sought aid in France, others that he waged a shadow war. But the truth is darker. Wallace was hunted not only by Englishmen, but by Scots. In 1305, betrayed by Sir John de Menteith, he was delivered into Edward's hands. What followed was not justice, it was theater. In London, he was paraded through jeering crowds, charged with treason, though he had never sworn to Edward. His reply still echoes, "I could not be a traitor, for I was never Edward's subject." They dragged him to Smithfield, hanged, cut down alive. His body mutilated, disemboweled, his heart torn out, his head fixed on London Bridge, his limbs nailed in Scottish towns as warnings.
But warnings can fail. Edward sought to erase Wallace. Instead, he forged a martyr. His death became legend, his name whispered in every glen, sung in ballads, magnified in Blind Harry's poem 2 centuries later. The Wallace of history, a guerrilla, a brief guardian, a man undone by betrayal, became Wallace the myth, Braveheart, freedom's champion. The truth is harsher, but no less powerful. Wallace was not a king, he was not invincible. He was a man who rose when others bowed, a man who turned humiliation into defiance. On the scaffold in 1305, Scotland's hope seemed to die with him. But history does not end on a gallows. In the shadows, another figure stirred, a noble with ambition, lineage, and ruthless will. Robert Bruce, and he would finish what Wallace began. It began in a church, with blood spilled before the altar. Greyfriars, Dumfries, February 1306. Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale, met his rival John Comyn under truce. They spoke of crowns, of claims, of betrayal. Tempers flared, blades were drawn. Comyn fell bleeding, struck down before holy walls. To kill a man was crime enough. To kill him in sanctuary was sacrilege. But Bruce had crossed the line that cannot be uncrossed. He would have the throne or die for it.
Weeks later, at Scone, he was crowned King of Scots. But he was no king in power. Edward I called him outlaw. The church excommunicated him. His rivals rose against him. His army was broken at Methven. His brothers were captured and executed. His sister was locked in an iron cage. His wife imprisoned in England. Bruce himself was hunted like a beast. Chroniclers whisper of him hiding in the Hebrides, of winters spent in caves, of watching his cause collapse into ashes. It should have ended there. But Bruce was made of harder iron. From the Western Isles, he struck back. He fought not as a king, but as a guerrilla. He burned castles rather than hold them, denying Edward their use. He slaughtered rivals without mercy, the Comans broken, dissenters crushed. In the Highlands and Isles, he gathered support, the clans giving him shelter and men. He became the king of the wilderness, rebuilding power step by brutal step. Edward I died in 1307, his body carried north but never crossing the border. His son, Edward II, lacked his father's iron will. Slowly, the balance shifted. Bruce's victories at Loudoun Hill and in the north began to turn despair into hope. By 1314, the struggle reached its climax at Bannockburn. The English marched with an army perhaps 20,000 strong, knights, longbowmen, infantry. Bruce commanded little more than 7,000. Yet on the eve of battle, he faced an English knight, Henry de Bohun, in single combat. Armed only with an axe, Bruce split his skull in one blow. The Scots roared. A king once hunted as outlaw, now stood as warrior champion.
The battle that followed was chaos and miracle. Schiltrons of spearmen held against waves of cavalry. English knights, trapped in marsh and mud, fell into confusion. Edward II himself fled the field. By its end, the English army was shattered, Scotland reborn. Bannockburn was not merely a victory, it was vindication. But Bruce knew swords alone could not hold freedom. Words must seal it. In 1320, the nobles of Scotland sent a letter to the Pope, the Declaration of Arbroath. It was no ordinary petition. It declared that Scotland's people, not kings, held sovereignty. It is not for glory, riches, or honors that we fight, but for freedom alone, which no good man surrenders but with his life. They swore loyalty to Bruce, but warned, if he failed them, they would find another. In an age of monarchs, it was a cry of a nation. It worked. By 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton forced England to recognize Scotland's independence. Against all odds, Bruce had won. And yet, he remained a paradox. Was he freedom's champion, or an opportunist who betrayed common, shifted allegiances, and seized power with bloodied hands? The chronicles do not agree. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps Scotland's survival required nothing less. Bruce did not live to see the peace endure. In 1329, aged and wasted by illness, some said leprosy, others a wasting disease, he died at Cardross. His body was buried at Dunfermline, beneath the abbey's stones. His heart, as he had wished, was carried by James Douglas toward the Holy Land, only to fall in battle in Spain. Even in death, Bruce reached beyond Scotland's borders. He left a free kingdom, but in fragile hands. His son, David II, was only 5, a child king in a land stalked by enemies. Scotland had won its independence, but could a child hold a crown bought with so much blood?
He was crowned a child. He reigned as a prisoner, and he died without an heir. David II, son of Robert the Bruce, lived a life that seemed more tragedy than triumph. He was 5 years old when the crown was placed on his head at Scone in 1329,
Scotland rejoiced in its freedom, won by Bruce's sword, but beneath the ceremony lurked fragility. A child king meant factions, and England waited like a hawk. In 1332, the shadow of Balliol returned. Edward Balliol, son of John Balliol, landed with an English-backed host. At Duplin Moor, Bruce loyalists were cut down by English archers, a bloody echo of Falkirk. The child king was hurried into exile, sent to France for safety. There, in Chateau Gaillard, he grew up not among Scots, but under the protection of Philip VI. For nearly a decade, Scotland fought without its king. When David returned in 1341, at the age of 17, his people looked for a warrior like his father. What they found was a youth shaped abroad, more French than Scot in manners, eager but untested. In 1346, he sought to prove himself. France, bound by the old alliance, begged for aid against England's wars. David marched south with a great host, confident of victory. At Neville's Cross, near Durham, the reckoning came. Edward III's archers cut the Scots down. Chroniclers describe chaos, banners trampled, men slaughtered. David himself fought bravely, struck in the face by an arrow, fighting on until overwhelmed. He was dragged from the field, king no longer free, but prisoner of England.
He would remain so for 11 years. England paraded him as a prize, a living trophy. He was lodged in castles, Windsor, Odiham, London, treated with honor, but always watched. Edward III used him as a pawn, dangling freedom in exchange for Scotland's obedience. Ransom demands were colossal, 100,000 marks, a sum that would cripple Scotland's economy for a generation. But worse was David's own offer. Desperate, perhaps broken, he proposed that if he died childless, the Scottish crown should pass to Edward's son, the Black Prince. To his captors, it was a masterstroke. To his countrymen, it was betrayal. The Scottish Parliament rose in defiance. They would pay his ransom, they would tax themselves to exhaustion, but they would never hand their crown to England. Chroniclers record their fury, the voice of a nation refusing to be sold. In 1357, after long negotiation, David was released under the Treaty of Berwick. The ransom stood, crushing and impossible, but the king was home. Yet his rule was marked by discontent. Taxes drained the realm, noble factions deepened. His childless marriages left succession uncertain. He tried, at times, to reassert power, but mistrust shadowed him. When he died in 1371, at the age of 46, his end was quiet, almost anticlimactic. No sons, no heirs of his own body. With him ended the Bruce line, the dynasty that had clawed Scotland's independence from English conquest. But history abhors a vacuum. The crown passed through his sister's line, to Robert Stewart. A new dynasty was born, one that would rule Scotland for centuries. Yet the memory of David II lingers, a boy king exiled, a warrior captured, a monarch who bargained with enemies, and a kingdom that defied even him to keep its freedom.
The Bruces won independence with blood and fire. The Stuarts inherited it by chance. In 1371, when David II died childless, the line of Robert the Bruce ended. The crown passed through his sister's son to Robert Stewart, grandson of the great king, but himself 60 years old, cautious, gray, and tired. He had fought in Bruce's wars, but he was no conqueror. He was crowned Robert II, first of the Stuart line. The Stuarts had long been at the heart of Scotland's story. As hereditary high stewards since the 12th century,
They had stood beside kings, commanded armies, and married into the royal house. By fortune of blood, they now wore the crown. But inheritance is not the same as strength. Robert II's reign revealed the fragility of the throne. Scotland was still scarred from war with England, its economy bled by decades of conflict, its nobility swollen with private armies and rival ambitions. The Douglases ruled the South like kings in all but name. In the North, the common legacy lingered. To the West, the lords of the Isles, Gallic and Norse in blood, commanded fleets and clans beyond royal reach. Robert II, mild by nature, often delegated authority to his sons. This bred more rivalry than stability. The Albany Stuarts carved out power, sometimes ruling more effectively than the king himself. Chroniclers wrote of a monarch overshadowed, a king in name but not in power. When Robert II died in 1390, the throne passed to his son, John. But John carried a cursed name. The memory of John Balliol still stank of humiliation. He took a new name, Robert III. If his father had been weak, Robert III was weaker still. A horse's kick had left him crippled, and he relied heavily on others to rule. His reign became a theater of faction. His brother, the Duke of Albany, rising as power behind the throne. His son, David, Duke of Rothesay, consumed by scandal and intrigue. The Douglases fighting endless border wars.
Meanwhile, Scotland itself was splitting. In the Highlands, Gaelic traditions still ruled, chieftains waging private wars and raids. In the Lowlands, burghs and castles spread feudal order. The crown was caught in the middle, unable to tame either side. The most symbolic moment came in 1396 at Perth, the Battle of the Clans. Two rival Highland groups, Chattan and Kay, were brought to fight before the king and court in a staged combat of 30 against 30. On the banks of the Tay, in front of nobles and bishops, Scotland's monarch watched his people slaughter each other, powerless to impose peace. This was the Stuart inheritance, a crown heavy with expectation, but hollow in authority. Were the Stuarts strong or merely lucky? They survived, yes, but often by chance. The blood of Bruce gave them legitimacy, but their reigns were riddled with minorities, regencies, assassinations and betrayals. Unlike their predecessors, they did not forge freedom. They struggled simply to keep the kingdom from breaking apart. Yet they endured. Through weakness, through faction, through chaos, the Stuarts clung to the throne. But the crown they inherited was no gift. It was a curse waiting to devour them. And soon it would.
Two kingdoms wore one crown. Lowland Scotland looked to England and Europe. The Highlands looked inward to clan, kin, and tradition. The crown sat uneasily between them, and the Stuarts bore its weight. When Robert II took the throne in 1371, he inherited not just Bruce's crown, but a divided realm. In the Lowlands, towns grew, trade with Flanders and France flourished, and nobles fought their wars with knights and castles. In the Highlands, the clans still ruled. Allegiance lay not with the king in Edinburgh, but with the chief, the bloodline, the cattle raid. The lords of the Isles, Gaelic rulers with Norse blood, commanded fleets that made the Hebrides and western seaboard a kingdom in all but name. Their allegiance to the crown was nominal, their loyalty shifting with advantage. To the crown in Edinburgh, they were both shield and threat, guardians of the western frontier, but potential kings themselves.
Robert III's reign made the split visible for all to see. Crippled and mocked for weakness, he could not impose unity. The most haunting spectacle came at Perth in 1396, the Battle of the Clans. Two Highland kin groups, Chattan and Kay, were ordered to settle their feud before the king. On a field by the Tay, 30 men fought 30, while Robert and his court looked on. Blood spattered the grass, men hacked one another down with sword and axe, until only a handful survived. The king had not united his people, he had staged their savagery as theatre. To lowland chroniclers, the Highlands seemed another world, lawless, barbaric, barely Christian. They mocked the Gaelic tongue, calling it Irish. They wrote of wild men who painted themselves, who valued honor above law. Yet in the Highlands, the lowlands looked little better, soft, foreign, traitors to Scottish identity.
The divide was more than geography. It was language, culture, and faith. The Highlands clung to older forms of kinship and the Church's looser authority. The lowlands embraced borough law, trade charters, and European-style monarchy. This was the Crown's burden. Could the Stuarts rule both Scotlands at once? The answer was never certain. For every Douglas in the Borders, there was a MacDonald in the Isles. For every borough that looked to Bruges or Paris, there was a glen that answered only to the voice of a clan chief. The Stuarts were kings of Scotland. But which Scotland? The crown was theirs, but the kingdom was slipping from their grasp.
He was king in name, but for 18 years he was a hostage. James I of Scotland was 12 years old when his ship was intercepted off the English coast in 1406. He had been bound for France, but instead he became a prisoner of King Henry IV. While Scotland was torn apart by faction, Albany regents ruling, nobles feuding, borders burning, its rightful king grew to manhood behind English walls. But captivity was not chains and darkness. England did not waste its prize. James was raised in royal households, schooled in governance, music, literature, and arms. He read the new poets, including Chaucer. He trained in knightly combat. He composed verses that still survive, blending chivalric ideals with longing for home. England was grooming not just a captive, but a Renaissance prince. When he returned to Scotland in 1424, released for a ransom of £40,000, he was not the boy who had left. He was a man of culture, intellect, and steel. He came home with an English bride, Joan Beaufort, sealing a fragile peace. But if Scotland hoped for mercy, they were mistaken. James had watched his kingdom from afar for nearly 2 decades, and he returned determined to reclaim it. And he struck hard. Scotland's nobility had grown fat in his absence. Douglases in the south, Albany Stuarts in the heartland, Highland chiefs raiding unchecked. They ruled like petty kings, taxing, warring, and robbing with impunity. James unleashed a campaign of reform and retribution. He tightened the coinage, demanded accounts of estates, and forced attendance at Parliament. He summoned burgh representatives, ensuring towns had a voice. He encouraged schools, monasteries, and clerical learning, dragging Scotland closer to European currents of governance.
But his reforms came with blood. In 1425, he struck at the Albany Stuarts, the very family who had ruled in his stead. Murdoch, Duke of Albany, and his sons were executed, their power broken. It was a warning to every magnate: no lord was above the crown. James also led campaigns into the Highlands, forcing chiefs to submit, seizing hostages to ensure loyalty. The king who had once been captive now made captives of his realm. Some praised him as a new Solomon, wise, learned, bringing justice. Others whispered that he was a tyrant, too eager to break rather than bend, too English in manner, too ruthless to be loved. In the end, his brilliance bred his doom. In 1437, in Perth, conspirators struck. Led by Robert Graham and allies of the Albany cause, they burst into the king's chambers at the Blackfriars Monastery. James tried to escape through a sewer tunnel beneath the floor, but the exit had recently been blocked, sealed to stop tennis balls from rolling away during his games. Fate had prepared his grave. Trapped, he fought with his bare hands, but he was cut down, stabbed over a dozen times before the Queen. Chroniclers say Joan Beaufort tried to shield him, wounded in the attempt. It was not assassination. It was butchery. The king, who had survived 18 years in foreign captivity, who had restored royal authority, who had sought to make Scotland a European kingdom, died like a hunted animal in the dark. But the blood on the monastery floor left a greater question hanging. If a king cannot trust his court, who truly rules Scotland? The Stuart crown passed from a murdered father to a child of 7. From the start, James II ruled in the shadow of blood.
His father had been butchered in a monastery. His early years were no safer. In 1440, while still a boy, James witnessed one of the most infamous events in Scottish history, the Black Dinner at Edinburgh Castle. The young king feasted with his Douglas cousins, only to see them dragged from the table and executed, their heads struck off in the castle yard. The lesson was clear. In Scotland, even kings ate beside death. As James grew, he learned that survival meant striking before being struck. His reign became a war against the Black Douglases, the most powerful noble family in the realm. They commanded lands stretching across the borders, alliances reaching into England and France, private armies that rivaled the king's own. To break them, James used both treachery and war. In 1452, he invited William Douglas, the 8th Earl, to Stirling under truce. At the royal table, tempers flared. James drew his dagger. The Earl was butchered in the king's presence. Another feast turned funeral. The killing shattered the Douglases' power. Step by step, James II brought down their castles and stripped their lands. For the first time in decades, the crown stood stronger than its greatest magnet. It was a bloody triumph, but a triumph nonetheless. And yet, James's reign is remembered for something more: the thunder of artillery. At Roxburgh in 1460, the last English fortress in southern Scotland faced a new weapon. Cannon fire shattered walls that had resisted siege for centuries. The age of the sword was giving way to the age of gunpowder. But fate was cruel. One gun exploded, killing James instantly. A king who had embraced modern war was destroyed by it. His reign ended in fire and smoke, but his legacy lived on, a stronger crown and a Scotland no longer wholly at the mercy of its barons. The crown passed to his son, James III, a boy of 9. At first, Scotland prospered under regents. But when James came to age, he revealed a taste for arts and architecture, music and astrology. He patronized goldsmiths, brought in foreign musicians, and began to surround himself with a circle of Renaissance intellectuals. To him, kingship was not just war, but culture.
But nobles wanted a warrior, not a dreamer. They muttered that the king valued singers more than swords. His brothers rebelled. Great lords, excluded from favor, accused him of tyranny. He sought alliances abroad, marrying Margaret of Denmark, securing Orkney and Shetland as part of her dowry. But at home, his kingdom seethed. By the 1480s, James was isolated, mistrusted, and desperate. He arrested lords, executed rivals, and clung ever more tightly to his court of artists and craftsmen. Nobles turned against him, rallying to his own teenage son. In 1488, at Sockyburn, father and son's forces met in battle. The king fled, only to fall from his horse and be slain by a soldier who did not know who he was. Thus ended James III, a king who dreamed of a Renaissance kingdom, but who could not master his nobles. His own son took the crown. The Stuarts in these years embraced modernity, gunpowder, diplomacy, Renaissance culture, but every step forward was dragged back by conspiracy, rebellion, and betrayal. Scotland in the 15th century stood between two worlds, Renaissance ambition and feudal ruin, and the crown balanced on the knife edge. He wore an iron chain beneath his robes, a penance for the blood of his father. James IV was crowned at 15 after the lords of Scotland rebelled against his father, James III. The boy accepted the crown but never escaped the guilt. Each year he added new links to that chain, a weight he carried until his death. Yet from this burden rose a king unlike any before him. James IV transformed Scotland. He was tall, eloquent, magnetic, a king who spoke Latin and Scots, Gaelic and French, who could argue law with scholars and play music with minstrels. His court glittered with poets, philosophers, physicians, and alchemists. He even funded an eccentric attempt at human flight, a man leaping from Stirling Castle with wings strapped to his arms. It ended in failure, but the ambition revealed a kingdom looking outward, restless, modern. James also turned Scotland into a naval power. In 1511, he launched the Great Michael, the largest ship afloat in Europe, a floating fortress of oak that dwarfed the fleets of kings. With this, Scotland seemed ready to stand as equal to England, France, or Spain. His diplomacy was just as bold. In 1503, he married Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England. The marriage was hailed as a treaty of perpetual peace. For the first time in centuries, it seemed the wars across the border might end. Few could know that this marriage would one day unite the crowns of Scotland and England under their great-grandson.
Yet, James was bound by the Auld Alliance, the pact with France. And when Henry VIII, Margaret's brother, went to war against France in 1513, James faced an impossible choice: break faith with France or break peace with England. He chose France. In September 1513, James led the largest Scottish army ever assembled across the border, perhaps 30,000 men. He brought artillery, banners of saints, and nobles eager for glory. They met the English at Flodden in the fields of Northumberland. The ground betrayed them. Rain turned the soil to mire. Scottish cannon dragged across hills could not be positioned. James ordered his men into deep formations of pikes, effective on level ground, but here the English billhooks tore through them. Hour after hour, the Scottish lines were driven back. James fought at the front, not as a distant commander, but as a knight among knights. He pressed into the thickest fighting, struck down English nobles, and was seen still swinging his sword when arrows and blades finally cut him down. He became the last king of the British Isles to die in battle, his body hacked and displayed as a trophy. Flodden was more than a defeat. It was a national disaster. Alongside their king, Scotland lost its bishops, its earls, its knights, the very flower of its leadership. Whole families of nobles were wiped out in a single day. The kingdom awoke leaderless, its government decapitated.
James IV had given Scotland its golden age, a court of learning, a navy to rival Europe, a marriage that planted the seed of future union. But his gamble at Flodden shattered it all.
His reign closed the medieval world of Scotland. His death dragged it into the modern age, scarred, grieving, and searching for survival. Scotland's history is not the tale of a triumphant empire. It is the story of a kingdom that refused to die. From the dark forests of Alba to the carnage at Flodden, Scotland endured what should have broken it. Rome's legions could not tame it. Viking longships battered its shores, yet were absorbed into its blood. Saxons and Normans pressed, but the kingdom survived. Civil wars, assassinations, betrayals, still the crown was never extinguished. Its kings fell in battle, were murdered in monasteries, or taken in chains to foreign prisons. But always another rose. A people who should have vanished into larger empires instead clung to their identity with iron teeth. And out of struggle were born the myths that would outlast the Middle Ages. Wallace, executed like a criminal, became immortal as a martyr. Bruce, condemned as opportunist and murderer, forged freedom at Bannockburn. The Declaration of Arbroath, written in ink to a distant pope, spoke in words that became scripture, so long as 100 of us remain alive. These were not victories, they were memories, and memory is stronger than conquest. By the 16th century, medieval Scotland was gone. Its kings wore Renaissance crowns, its battles fought with cannon, its court filled with poets and musicians. Yet the defiance of the old kingdom lingered. In every story of betrayal and resistance, in every ruined castle and weathered cross, the soul of a people endured. Scotland's greatness was never measured by conquest or empire. It was measured by survival.
And in the end, the truth is simple. In Scotland, freedom was never given, it was always taken. Thank you for journeying with us through the mists and battles of medieval Scotland. If this tale of defiance, resilience, and the spirit of a nation stirred your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another story from history's shadows. Share your thoughts below. Which Scottish legend captured your imagination the most? And in the end, the truth is simple. In Scotland, freedom was never given, it was always taken. Thank you for journeying with us through the mists and battles of medieval Scotland. If this tale of defiance, resilience, and the spirit of a nation stirred your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another story from history's shadows. Share your thoughts below. Which Scottish legend captured your imagination the most?